No worries. Okay, proposition one. Whenever you're ready, you have for up to 8 minutes, assuming panel is ready, and preferences reflect.
Can I confirm I'm audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. She, her pronouns, verbal POIs. That being said, my time starts in 3, 2, 1. More often than not, dominant ruling parties did not lose because other parties gained more relative success. They fall apart because due to scandal and corruption and mistakes. We think priming ourselves for the long run to wait for this to inevitably happen and capitalize off of the mistakes of the dominant ruling party is a much more strategic for the opposition's best interests. For those reasons, proud to propose 2 pieces of stance before I move on to arguments. Firstly, we think being ideologically moderate should not be conflated with that of being ideologically similar to the dominant party, ruling party, but opposition necessarily has to defend being perceived as extreme in their world, as any stance too far distant from the dominant ruling party stance is extreme in comparison and extreme due to relative scenarios. But secondly, as long as the largest opposition party, we think the metric of success is not to necessarily win the presidency or make the country become bipartisanship, given the likelihood or the lack of the propensity of this happening in their world. I think this looks more like fulfilling some of the ideological goals and break into mainstream politics in the perspective of this opposition party. And lastly, this debate is probably more likely to be about parliamentary systems, as we don't want opposition to fall into the trap of this debate falling under US-centric systems such as the House of Representatives or the Senate system, because excluding America, most countries often within the motion and the context of the motion are relevant to this existing system as opposed to the other. We also think there's a huge misconception in their world that the presidency or gaining the branch is the end-all be-all. We don't necessarily think this is the ultimate metric. We think 10 years worth of productive policymaking is much more important and weighs higher than a term of presidency in their best world, where it's likely to be filled with a lot of inefficiencies and bureaucratic lags and whatnot. Before I move on to my arguments, I'll be willing to take a clarification. Seeing none. First argument on the power for the oppositional political party. The premise of this argument is that opposition has to defend a world in which there are certain issues or voting topics and ideological clashes that you fundamentally cannot win on, given that a majority of the population ideologically does not agree with you or align with you. The issue is, if you hedge your party's policies on the extremes, you cannot win on these issues due to the lack of popularity. Therefore, it is within the incentives of the party to hedge its winning line on moderacy and cooperation. The mechanism under this argument are simple. It's that one, we're able to gain support from the majority and to mainstream demographics, thereby increasing the power of the party. And if you hedge your party's winning line on the moderate, universally applicable issues, you're more likely to gain more votes from the masses as opposed to hedging your winning line on a very short subsect of the population on extreme values. But secondly, if you're able to frame your policies to this dominant ruling party as common ground issues that the mainstream party ought to resolve in the interest of the people, they're likely to cooperate with you, given that they gain power by appealing to the masses, and they likely want to help the people on the ground because they represent them, as opposed to prioritizing political ideologies, because ideologies don't exist within a vacuum. This party is likely to be representative of the interests of the people. There are 3 stakeholders this argument. Firstly, this is much more comfortable for voters to switch in our world, where they don't have to forgo a majority of their stances on certain issues when they opt into extreme ideologies within their world, within the opposition party, and they're more likely to be able to switch over comfortably, given that they agree on a lot of general issues. But secondly, this is much more comfortable for politicians to cooperate with you when you're seen as being cooperative and when you're seen as being open to suggestions and whatnot. But thirdly, and most importantly, when the media trusts you, you're more likely to be able to break into moderate politics and within mainstream media. For example, in Japan, the new CDP party gained a lot of seats this way and are seen as productive and are able to gain a lot of good image making within this world. And they're likely to be seen as much more productive within our world. The weighing under this argument and the impacts are simple. It's that we gain more political success, and this probably looks like, in the worst case, we have a good enough number of seats to form coalitions and to have enough voting power to sway governors and mayors from this party. And we're also able to have a good amount of influence through the media and have more voting power within the House or to pass or not pass legislation. And this is our worst case. But in the long run, in our absolute best case, we can get more reaches of power through the more extreme ways. For example, during the right timings when the dominant messes up, such as Modi's party, the BJP, took over the ruling Liberal Party this way. But even if so that we don't get presidents within the next 10 or 20 years, that is fine insofar as that, number one, in the meantime, we're able to be productive and gain political success in being able to pass these legislations. But secondly, we're likely to gain more internal success within the country, and this was much more important. Before I move on to my weighing, sure.
How do you ensure the downfall of the dominant party when you're unable to call them out on their corruption and mistakes?
But you're confusing what our winning line is. It's that we're able to gain a lot of efficiency and a lot of political productivity within the meantime, and our winning line isn't hedged on the idea that the dominant ruling party will fall. We don't need a presidency necessarily in order to fulfill our winning line. We just need to prove that you have enough influence within the internal systems of the government in order to pass some legislations or to agree on some ideological sort of voting issues. But secondly, this is a comparative debate. So we're unlikely to see opposition gain any forms of a big, huge amount of political backing within their world, but they won't be able to increase the power of the party within their world. And this is a response to their POI as well. But secondly, even in the long run, even if the party doesn't win the presidency, we're fine with this insofar as that our mechanisms prove where we're likely to, number one, in the meantime, opt into passing some legislation in our favor, which is more than what they're going to be able to get. But secondly, in the long run, set up the chessboard for checkmate when the dominant ruling party weakens or might fail in the long run. The second argument is on how in opposition's world, extremism loses the party's power in the short run and the long run, and they're unable to get the presidency as well in their world. There are 4 reasons to us why sudden extreme change wouldn't work out. The first being that most moderates within your party will leave if they don't support extremism. And given that this is likely to be in a parliamentary system, they're more able to leave to other more moderate versions of the party. But secondly, it's harder to break into the mainstream media because you're unable to have control of the narrative from the ruling party. And given that they're likely to propagate narratives against you, you're likely to be seen as worse within your country internally. But thirdly, more often than not, the reason why the dominant party is popular is because the population rejects extremist ideas due to historical instances and historical grievances. This is true in Japan and in South Africa and Mexico. They often reject extremism due to historical reasons, and extremist ideas are generally not taken well within the context of these countries. But lastly, even if they win, extremist ideas are more often than not swayed by the short-term anger of citizens. And because of the short-term aspect of this idea and this mechanism, eventually the dominant party will be able to push back. This was true in Bolsonaro in Brazil. This was true for Meloni in Italy. And this is just true for the Golden Dawn party in Greece. And for those reasons, we're likely to see that in opposition's world, extremism loses them within the presidency and within legislation. But the impact of this is threefold. It's that number one, the dominant ruling party is going to exploit this failure in the long run through rhetoric by framing the opposition party as being extreme and not representative of the people's interests. But secondly, they're likely to leverage this even in the long run. This is true for a lot of countries. For example, this world looks like Italy, where Meloni is, as a very far right prime minister, is unable to pass any sort of legislation within their world in their best case, because most people do not agree with his ideologies and most people do not agree with the implications of his policies. But in the future, even when the dominant ruling party makes a mistake, side opposition cannot swoop in to take the power or tip the scale in their favor. And this is exactly what happened in South Africa, where the dominant ruling party continuously makes mistakes, but there is no sufficient opposition that the people are willing to support. And for those reasons, we don't think they're able to gain power for the opposition party. For those reasons, proud to propose.
All right. We thank the speaker for their fine speech and invite opposition one whenever they're ready. Hear, hear.
Hello, can I check that I am audible and visible okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Perfect, okay. I will take my POIs verbally. I will not look at the chat, so I won't see them. And I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Aligning yourself with the political party you wish to defeat ties you to a sinking ship. We sever the bond and ensure that opposition parties can swim to success, so proud to oppose. The first thing I want to do in this debate is issue a clarification. Proposition tried to tell you that the main opposition parties we are talking about in this debate are extreme, that they are people who the general amount of the population reject and who they simply believe to be too extreme on a political spectrum. Note how this literally doesn't make any sense. For this party to be the main and the largest opposition party, they must have a degree of widespread support among the people. These parties are not the extremists. They are simply perhaps a centre-right in opposition to a centre-left governing party. We're talking about parties like the DA in South Africa who made significant gains of the ANC. These are the parties we're talking about, not some extremist coalition who do damage to the country. One point of setup then on what the incentives of these parties that we're discussing are. This is threefold. Firstly, they wish to win votes. Secondly, they wish to call out the governing party in order to capitalise on dissatisfaction. But thirdly, they wish to exploit changing political narratives which enable them to ride to victory. Notice they have to accept taking very similar stances to main parties, or else they still seem opposed and do not meet their burden. They cannot just say that they are taking a different stance. That stance has to, by the burden of this motion, be something similar to that of the governing party. First argument then, all of us will be integrated throughout. First argument on how we allow opposition parties to be more successful in national elections. The thesis of this claim is that we allow the main opposition party to enter the room where it happens by ensuring that they're able to capitalise on widespread support, whereas on Proposition's world, they lose all of them. Let's look at them first. Why do Proposition lose voters for opposition parties who remain attached to the party under our side of the house? 4 reasons. Firstly, your supporters now disagree with your ideas. When you make the kind of ideological jump that Proposition are proposing these opposition parties make, then what happens is all the people who previously supported your party, people who lended you their support, campaigned for you and donated to your cause, they all move because they see that you are no longer fighting for the ideological exceptions that they wish to see implemented in the country. Second reason, other opposition parties are unable to grow. What Proposition actually succeed in doing is splintering the opposition vote to the governing parties. Smaller opposition parties are able to rise up by being more extreme. That is how they get extremism under their side of the house, not how we get it under ours. Third reason is because the dominant opposition party becomes split. This can look like people within the party being upset about the ideological change that the party is making and therefore leaving to go and join other extremist opposition parties, and they bring their support with them. This chaos and divide within the main opposition party means that people are unwilling to vote for them because they perceive them to be someone who cannot properly govern the country. But fourthly, apathy just spreads under their side of the house because there already exists a narrative under all democratic systems that all political actors are exactly the same, all out for their own self-seeking motivations. It is under their side that they clarify that narrative. It is under their side that they cement it and make people think that all parties are actually the same by way of showing them that everyone is actually arguing for things which are very similar, meaning fewer people vote and you just get a political system which is less healthy under their side of the house. Why then do Prop not gain voters from dominant parties? They tell you that it is incredibly easy for voters who previously aligned to the dominant governing party to switch for their support to the opposition party simply because they've made a simple change. Let's look at a couple of reasons why that's not true. Firstly, on preference for the establishment. There are 3 reasons why these voters will still lend their support to the main governing party even if the opposition party has made an ideological switch. A, the governing party are able to point to historical policies and cultural successes, meaning they are able to advocate far better why they should remain in government. It's much easier to win when you're an incumbent. But secondly, the party is just well known. These people are likely household names, meaning that they have a degree of brand recognition, which opposition parties just don't. But thirdly, they exist in a degree of consistency, which these opposition parties do not have. Notice the radical nature of what Proposition is telling these opposition parties to do. They're telling them to shed decades of ideological consistency and align themselves closer with a party which, for their entire existence, they have opposed. This just means that your party looks as though it cannot keep a consistent line. The governing party simply says, you can't vote for this opposition because they're lying to you. They're switching about what they believe constantly, and therefore we cannot trust them with governance of this country. But second reason why they don't get the support of the moderates is that the desire for real change has not been met. Swapping parties is inherently difficult insofar as the motivation for voting for a different party is because you want actual change to exist in your country. Look at the examples where recently opposition parties have made gains. In Modi's India, the aptly named India Coalition managed to get support because they were offering something different to the Hindu nationalism that Modi proposes. The ANC lose votes at the point in which they allow blackouts to continue in their country and their people suffer. It is not simply because these parties are just continuing along and suddenly something changes. People desire real change. They desire an ideological swap, and that is why they support opposition. They do not do so under the Proposition side of the house. What does it mean to lose the support? 3 reasons. Firstly, you as a main opposition party now lose any hope of being able to form a government. They try to tell you that this is their best case. I would note, panel, it doesn't happen at all under Proposition insofar as all of the issues we've already characterized main opposition parties. But secondly, you are completely unable to enter coalitions insofar as you no longer have the votes for that to be something that is worthwhile. Notice, in order for them to prove that these opposition parties are able to enter into coalition, they needed to prove why the governing parties are likely to lose votes. Insofar as they haven't done that, then there is no explanation why a coalition is needed by the governing party. Therefore, there's no explanation why opposition fill this gap. But thirdly, you just can't take enough votes as an opposition party in order to prevent a supermajority from happening. Under their side of the house, they hand legitimacy to the governing parties to do things like pass constitutional amendments which give them power for decades. Under our side, uniquely, we are able to get enough support for opposition parties that we are able to prevent this from happening, even if we don't get opposition parties actually into government. Notice here the cyclical nature of losing support, because when you as a party lose support in one election, it becomes very difficult for you to climb back out of that hole, insofar as you've lost major donors, you've lost supporters who have been loyal to you for decades, and it just becomes far harder for you to get back to a position where you're able to win elections.
Point of information.
Under the status quo, the dominant parties are losing support. This shift is driven not by some radical change in people's policies, but simply because people want real change to happen in their country. They want to see things which are different. Only we allow opposition parties to capitalize on this feeling. We enable them to get, more voters, meaning they are likely to push for change in that party, even if that doesn't mean actually achieving a majority. But secondly, even in our worst case, at least we don't hemorrhage the supporters that proposition do by way of ideologically switching themselves to something which is not consistent for the past. Why is it bad to lose these supporters? It's bad because you lose expertise, you lose connections, and you lose trust, all of which are valuable to you being able to build a party which is actually beneficial in the future. They say people don't swap due to ideology. We tell you that when you are seeing your country experience rapid power cuts, you've swapped any party which is offering you change, even if that party is an opposition party who you previously didn't lend your support to. We think the change happens all of the time, and we think it's only under our side where we allow it to continue and kick out these governing parties doing so much harm. Before I move on, I'll take a quick point.
The reason why the DA was able to become the largest oppositional party in South Africa is because it maintained a relationship with the ANC and frequent political neutrality. You need to defend a world where the DA is significantly opposed to the ANC in South African politics.
Yeah, and we support that because we've just told you that the reason why most opposition parties are able to access support is because they capitalize on a feeling of a desire for real change in countries. You never allow this to happen, instead creating apathy by showing people that actually all politics really is the same. Second argument then on how we allow opposition parties to more successfully call out harmful corruptions in political systems. Why are proposition unable then to call out corruption? Firstly, because these parties just pally with the government, meaning that they just don't wish to call it out because they don't wish to harm the connection that they have with them. But secondly, because they seem like the same party, because they are ideologically aligned, they don't want to be drawn into these charges of corruption, so they simply don't call it out in the first place. Why then can smaller parties not call out corruption? Is simply because they are not successful insofar as they themselves are small, and so the media doesn't pay attention to them. Governing parties simply sweep this corruption under the rug. Why do we then, on opposition, enable opposition parties to call out this corruption, and why is this important? Because decreasing the corruption of political systems decreases the ability of apathy to spread amongst your political system. People don't vote in political elections because they see it as something that is dominated by sleaze, dominated by corruption. Only under our side do we give opposition parties the ability to actually call this out and clean up political systems. But secondly, opposition parties have a desire and an incentive to clean up politics insofar as they wish to one day inherit these political systems. Therefore, it's not anywhere near their incentives to allow this corruption to continue, whereas under their side, continuing to allow this corruption and these harmful actions to spread within political systems just enables them to get out of having to blame themselves or their friends in politics for these actions, because we allow opposition to actually oppose and create real change. So proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the speaker for their fine speech, and assuming everyone's ready, invite Proposition 2 to come and respond. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Oh yeah, myself. Okay, we'll start in 3, 2, 1. Clearly, the other side did not really listen to our clarification on what it means to be politically successful. It's not that you immediately have to have one of the members within your party become the president or the prime minister. We told you that it's also about how productive you are as a party, how many laws that you can pass, how many governors you can have around the country, how many political campaigns can be successful in certain district elections. I think these are important aspects where if you jump into the conclusion of how can you win the presidential election or how can you get the prime minister into politics, I think that's immediately where you lose. Because we're not talking about countries where you can immediately there's like two parties they can choose from and it's very competitive. It's a country where one dominant party has been in power for several decades. It looks like cases such as we told you, Japan or even South Africa, where indeed you can't just immediately win elections, and that's the problem with their first argument already, right? So then for one clarification before I move on to rebutting the two arguments and talking about some weighing and rebuilding on our stuff. First, on the idea of clarification of will they be seen as too extreme? I think in most cases, they will be seen as extreme, even in South Africa as shown, right? We told you often it leads to a situation where indeed the party can be seen too extreme. The reason why the new Liberal Party in Japan made their own new one with the approach of a more moderate stance is because they wanted to be seen as less extreme and more moderate, because often the majority, the dominant conservative party, which has called them off as being too extreme, and it just didn't work out for them. But even if they aren't seen as extreme, we will tell you as to why this is dysfunctional, and it can lead to many problems such as you not being politically functioning and productive. So then on the two arguments, first on the idea of better in elections. The thing that they mainly said are 4 parts. Well, number one, you lose supporters because you are too similar. You're like too similar, and you lose a lot of like hardcore supporters. Number one, often the second most popular parties are not usually extreme parties anyways. They are already pretty much moderate. It's the idea of more under their side where they lean towards a more of distinguishing themselves, which can be seen as extreme. Sure, even if you lose some of those supporters, I think that's fine, because we think that those small amount of supporters that are more away from that centrist moderate stance are usually people that are minority of the country anyways. When we look at these huge parties, the way that they win elections are margins of like 70 to even 80%. These are situations where you clearly should not focus on the rest 20-30%, which also tend to be in other extremist coalitions or parties anyways, which you shouldn't focus on. Rather, it's the supporters of the dominant party that you should try to focus on and get, right? I think that is a much smarter approach instead of the idea of focusing on the few that you might lose by becoming more moderate. But second of all, the idea of a smaller opposition get more votes with extreme ideas. Again, we said we're willing to take the trade-off. Matter of fact, we told you under their side, it's more likely when you take indeed certain stances that are seen as too unproductive or especially too distinguished, which can also lead to people leaving because your party is just simply unproductive. But then third of all, division within the party. I think that this is worse, as I've already just told you, because of the idea that you are less likely to be successful in elections, but also because the dominant party actively blocks you from actually making any legislative change. More politicians are likely to leave the party and join the other party because it's just not functional and it's not productive, and it's hard for them to indeed win governor seats, or it's hard for them to pass any kind of legislation that they want. But at last, the idea of apathy about how all politicians look the same, and eventually because they can't distinguish themselves, it'll look bad. But we completely deny this idea. I think instead, a lot of people will see these people as reasonable individuals that are able to indeed compromise and work for the idea of stability and functionability of the government itself, right? We think that especially under our side, because we preserve the idea of stability instead of the idea of causing chaos in order to get what I want, people will hate you less. People will think you as a more reasonable person. We told you under their side, when they actively put stalemates of certain legislation and make people more pissed off that the government can't pass certain legislation, I think that's the kind of situation where you're more likely to be seen as the villain within politics and less likely to get supporters from the majority, right? So I think that they're focusing on the wrong voter base here. They should not focus on the small minority that will never win you elections, but rather the majority that are of the dominant party and trying to slowly, gradually take voters from their side. When there's a certain political issue, the approach isn't that, oh, we immediately go the opposite of what the party says, but instead modify what the party has said and tweak it a little bit so that it's more of a conservative or liberal or whatever your party stance may be, twist it a bit so that it seems somewhat reasonable for people to also support this and reject this idea maybe. So we think that kind of softer approach is what makes you be seen as a more reasonable politician, especially during current political era where often many politicians are seen as too nationalistic or too populist or too extreme or whatnot.
Point.
So then a second argument about better calling out corruption. I think that this very rush argument, the premise of it is wrong. It's the idea that a lot of these parties apparently don't call out corruption. But that's very, very untrue, and I don't know why this premise is even a thing. It's experience and stability and patience that makes people think that the opposition party that is second best can possibly take over the leading role. Because often, even if the parties do call out corruption, the reason why people just ignore it is because they feel like the opposition party is too extreme to take that role. They would rather have the leading party, even if they're corrupt, because they make the policies that we think are reasonable, we're willing to take that. And that's the reason why people aren't willing to accept another party to take that leading role, even if they're corrupt, even if they made certain mistakes, because they feel like in the end, the other party is not indeed experienced enough, they don't have what it takes to take that leading role. I think that's the reason as to why, especially this isn't going to be the case. So the premise of this argument simply it's just false. Often they do call out corruption. The problem is that people, even if they know that the leading party has committed corruption, just the Japanese party or whatnot, even South African majority party, I think especially the reason why they don't do anything about it is because they feel like no other party can replace the leading party. And for the people to think that there can be someone that can indeed take that new role when the big party makes a mistake, it's only possible if indeed this other smaller party that is second best has the is seen as a reasonable party that knows how to deal with politics, is filled with experience, stability, and patience. So before moving on to the weighing of winning angles, yes.
You say that opposition parties are small enough to be hopeless at achieving power. Then you tell us that they are big enough that their withdrawal of support from government policies will create stagnation in the government and lead to resentment. Which one is it?
Wait, say the first part again. You cut off.
You say that opposition parties are small enough to be hopeless at achieving power. Then you say that they are big enough that their withdrawal of support from government policies will lead to them being resented for creating stagnation. Which one is it?
No. I'm saying that you will look or you'll be villainized by your own supporters more because your approach is that always just saying no to a lot of the majority policies that were given, never able to modify it, and you never able to actually possibly pass any legislation because you're never willing to work with the majority party. And obviously people within your own party, the supporters do not want to support you and will villainize you because you're seen as nothing but an unproductive party that always tries to stalemate things and can never make things function. I think that's a huge difference. We're not talking about general public opinion. We're talking more about the voter base themselves and how they would perceive it. So there are winning angles on both sides. I think the biggest problem with their side is that they think the idea of completely saying there needs to be huge change within the country and all this idea of a complete revolution is a good idea, but that's simply not true. There's a reason why these parties tend to be very like the majority leading nations. It's because of the idea that often they have had bad past with extreme idea or the idea of revolutionary or huge changes. Because, for example, in Japan, when they have fascist militia and a lot of like dictatorship governments in the past, especially during World War II, I think these are situations where they also tend to have historical past and reasons as to why they reject a lot of huge change or extremism. Because they really very much respect the idea of stability and the idea of actual productivity, that's the reason as to why our side would make much more sense. Because the people simply do not want to take the big risk of having complete change within their country. And that's the reason why these countries tend to be, these like parties, that the dominant ones tend to be very, very popular. We think that then, because our winning angle, productivity, stability, and patience. First on productivity, that as we wait for the mistake to happen, because often dominant parties fall apart because they make a huge mistake or they have corruption issue, that's when we step in. The idea of stability, that we don't want to make the gamble and fall apart, but also the idea of patience. We don't have to win the presidency or prime minister right now. In the later on, we try to win it through the idea of seeing what the right timing is. For those reasons, they have a huge burden to prove, more than proud to propose.
All right, we thank the speaker for their fine speech and invite opposition 2 to come and respond. Hear, hear.
Hello, can everyone see and hear me okay?
Yep.
Amazing. POIs in chat, please. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Listen to the strategy that side proposition are trying to tell you. We're going to sit and wait for this dominant party to mess up so much that voters will abandon them, and we're going to hope to catch the ones that they fall. This stance is as weak as the parties they're trying to create. It's never going to work. A couple of themes to engage with in this speech. First, we're going to look at the shifting bonds of power and why we think we're likely to gain more votes and what that looks like. What I want to flag here is we agree this is not a question of necessarily always winning the presidency, and that was never what our vote was premised on. It was about 1, protecting the gains we've already made as the largest opposition party that currently exists, and 2, being able to step in as we think the current trends exist towards things that are anti-establishment and dissatisfaction with the status quo across the world. Second, we're going to look at the idea of what criticism looks like and can they actually actualize their grabbing in and stepping in where there are mistakes. Okay, let's talk about power then. They try to tell you they're going to have ways to co-opt votes because we're currently perceived as extreme. I think they're wildly inconsistent in a lot of their stances here. They try and tell you, oh, we're not going to be similar to them, we're actually just going to be moderate, but later that this is an easier swing for voters to make because you're very, very similar to the parties that they currently exist. We think it is just unlikely that they occupy extreme stances because you would just occupy what is likely the other side of the political spectrum. As you're someone who is the largest opposition party, and even if you don't have all of the seats in government, you probably gain like the largest other side, you're probably just like left of center comparative to their right of center ideology. Now, they try and tell you it doesn't matter if you're actually extreme or not, but you are likely painted as extreme by the other side. I think that implies that they have another side which is very, very far away from them in those cases. What does this mean for their first mechanism on gaining support from the majority? What this means is if you think these majority parties are quite far on the extreme themselves, there's no one in that you're going to be picking up in chat, please. There's no one in the middle that you're going to be accessing, right? Because if they are so far away from you, they're able to successfully paint the opposition as extreme, then where's your moderate ground that you're likely to access in these scenarios? We're willing to accept there aren't floating voters that are just in the middle. These are often polarized places, because what we think is, sure, the ruling party tries to paint you as relatively extreme. You then also respond within your supporters and within media to say, we think that you are the ones who are extreme and we're quite polarized and separated from you in these scenarios. What that means is there isn't just a moderate ground in which people are more likely to agree on, but rather in a polarized society, we have separate ideology, which means that they're not likely to be able to pick up people who are just floating around in the center or be particularly palatable to people who have these ideologies. The second mechanism, though, on how they're going to gain more power is that it's just a much more comfortable shift for voters to make. A couple of responses to this. First, we think we can swing voters on other things than purely ideology, right? Because there are just outcomes which a lot of voters want. So if you're in South Africa, you want there to be fewer blackouts, which means we're often fighting for the same aims, but different options of how to get them. We weaponize not being the party which created these and instead creating policies which show people how we're able to get that. What we think is that at the end of the day, people will prioritize things like the healthcare or money that they have access to over things like ideology. And given we have these trends away from disliking the establishment, as we see things like economic and environmental difficulties, that we're able to weaponize those anyway. But additionally, they never analyze why that shift would necessarily happen, because as Mia characterizes, we think that people will preferentially choose the establishment given two parties that are very, very similar, because they have things like trust that they're not going to absolutely send the country to war or do anything like that, but also they have things like the ANC always being associated with positive revolution in its history, or just their family also voting for the ANC. There's a myriad of reasons why you'd opt for the establishment, even if one of them has had like a sex scandal or something in the recent past, where you'd always choose that establishment rather than a smaller party that espouses similar ideology. The third mechanism then is that you get more cooperation from other politicians in government. I'm not quite sure what this looks like. Does this mean that you like become friends with the other party and you're able to have like a nice chat with them and they maybe listen to you? You're still opposition, you're still trying to take votes away from them. So I'm unclear as to why they would necessarily like form those cooperations and agree with you. But additionally, even in those scenarios, if you're just opting to cooperate with them, then you're not influencing anything in the first place. So it doesn't matter if you become great friends. If you always agree with them, you're not influencing policy in those scenarios anyway. And by your voters, you're just perceived as an actual doormat who isn't getting anything done. The final mechanism then is that they're going to become more efficient because they're going to break through into the mainstream media. I mean, firstly, evidently the largest opposition party is just present in the mainstream media because they're doing things like having debates with the party. They're doing things like being the biggest other campaign in the election. When you see the main governing party rebutting the opposition, that means that they're like included in the media anyway, right? They're in the debates, they're in things like that. But additionally, I would flip this and say you're much more likely to lose media coverage when you become this party who's like fundamentally quite boring. Because if you're occupying a middle ground where there are no floating voters for you to pick up, and at the end of the day, you're saying a diluted version of what the main and more charismatic and more well-known main party is saying, that's something that becomes less popular and interesting. Whereas if you're saying we're openly calling them out, we're openly disagreeing with them, we're holding a rally that's powerful and is trying to gain support for things like principles like democracy, which they don't stand for, that's something that's much more likely to be publicized. For these reasons, I don't think there are mechanisms about cooperation and media breakthrough. And they're also not people who are picking up voters. Let's bring in our mechanisms, or why we think they in fact lose voters. We tell you a couple of things about they lose voters who are ideologically aligned. They tell you, but they're only like a relatively small part of the population that you're losing, so we don't really care about them. Well, it does matter if they're your voter base and you're not picking up voters from elsewhere. As per my previous analysis, they haven't analysed where they gain a significant portion from the current ruling party, unless they make a gigantic mistake which causes a load of people to flee. In which case, losing your majority just does mean losing the seats which you currently have, which is detrimental. We're going to need impacting analysis here as to why you do things like grant the ruling party a supermajority to make constitutional changes, which makes it even harder for you to ever get in the first place, right? And then they tell you, well, actually, the party is already quite similar, so probably the ideological differences aren't that big anyway. See the contradiction that has with all the rest of their case, so I don't think it lands a response. But additionally, we give you reasons as to why they're likely to lose people who currently who currently agree with the stance of the party and why that is likely detrimental, and they are unable to pick up voters from elsewhere. What this means is, even if we make absolutely no gains, they just become a weaker and weaker party. What we think happens to those other people who are now really dissatisfied with the inconsistency, those people who are influential in that ruling party, in that opposition party, they become angry, they flee to other parties who are likely to be more on the trends of the extreme. They try and tell you that, like, oh, people will never support extremes in these countries because they have historical reasons to be anti the extremes. Obviously, this only applies necessarily on one side of the spectrum, but I don't think this applies in the long term, because if you feel an extreme is needed to get any change in a system, we just have two parties who are incredibly similar to one, and more than that, you've been betrayed by the party that you thought supported you. I think that's a chance where you're willing to jump at the extreme if you still think it's a good idea, if you're likely radicalized by that ideology. Before I move on to the mechanisms about calling out, I'll take that POI.
This debate is about a dominant ruling party. Your winning line is on overthrowing them on votes. We gave you structural
No.
reasons.
It's
Why
not on overthrowing them over votes. It's that you're going to lose all of the votes. We think we already see a trend on the status quo of people being dissatisfied with these parties and dissatisfied with the status quo. The only way you weaponize that is by calling them out. That's how we gain more votes and we become one that can form a coalition, or maybe in the future can overthrow them. But fundamentally, you need to explain why you're not just hemorrhaging votes and hemorrhaging the support you have under their side. Why do we think they're unable to successfully call them out under their side? Because notice, their analysis relies on them waiting for a mistake to happen, and that mistake being sufficient for them to get those votes in their best case. Why is the calling out not happening? Henry just says, oh, of course you can call them out. Of course you can call them out. And now we have someone who can take the role. But a couple of responses to this. One, if you call out individuals or you call out the leaders of the party, you risk these interpersonal connections which you're trying to build in those scenarios. So now you're a doormat that doesn't have different policies and you've got no friends, which I think is really detrimental. But second, calling out policies for being bad, policies which you are yourselves trying to cooperate, risks you being tarnished with the same brush. Because if you say that these policies and ideologies are negative, you are now tarnished with the same brush, and then everyone believes that you have those similar ideologies and you become brushed and damaged by those voters. What that means is you are less able to call out things like corrupt practices, but also policies that are really poor and are unlikely to work, because you're having to stand over very similar ideologies to try and grab their voters when they come, and you don't want to risk these relations. What this means is, if those mistakes do happen, you cannot capitalize them on a great extent, and voters, if they will do anything about those mistakes, will abandon politics rather than vote for a party that they think is likely to make the same mistakes. That means that even in their best case, they're not going to catch those voters, because those voters are never going to abandon an establishment, because there isn't an opposition and there's no one who's calling them out for the mistakes that they make. For strong democracy side opposition.
All right, we thank the speaker for their fine speech and invite Proposition 3 to come and close substantive for their bench. Hear, hear.
Wait, can you hear me?
Yep.
Right. He and pronouns are all POIs. KWCC ESPA beat Team Scotland as proposition on a politics motion in prelims. History repeats itself, so it's time for KWCC to beat them on proposition on a politics debate again. At the top of this speech, I want to clarify the structural reasons why the dominant ruling party will continue its dominance even when the opposition party is significantly oppositional and ideologically distinct, and examined what the implications this characterization has on the strategy of this round. One, dominance is often based on an electoral system design which is highly proportional in these countries that we are talking about, which means that they allocate seats based on the national vote totals, which systematically benefits these larger parties. This is why in the status quo in South Africa, the closed list proportional representation system has helped the ANC maintain dominance. So it's likely that even if in our very, very worst case where some voters do tend to, even in our very worst case where some of these loyal supporters of these parties necessarily don't vote for the major oppositional party, they necessarily needed to prove to you what the end implication of what they get uniquely for the actor is. Secondly, on historical legacy, which was never actually responded to, that in South Africa, for instance, the ANC's role in the anti-apartheid struggle gives it a strong historical legitimacy that resonates with the various amounts of voters. So even if you necessarily have a blackout, what the ANC does is in its rhetoric point to every other instance in which it has helped South Africa grow, such as the end of apartheid, such as creating a new constitution, such as providing housing. Obviously, the housing is not perfect, but what the ANC does is point to the fact that other parties have not gotten anything done for South Africa, that it is the only party that has able to provide some lights for communities, and that is what it will continue to do. But also in cases like Japan, the LDP has always been directly associated with Japan's post-war economic miracle, which means that individuals are less likely to always blame that dominant party for all of the socioeconomic problems that are existing immediately, and consider the fact that the major opposition party has done even less for the country and their families and citizens. But But thirdly, in general, this is very important. These dominant parties have an overwhelming influence on national democratic institutions because long-term dominance allows parties to shape institutions and policies in ways that reinforce their power. This is especially why through several layers of bureaucracy and media control, the dominant party can glorify the importance of its power. So for instance, this looks like during President Zuma's presidency in South Africa, the ANC dominated the South African broadcasting corporations, which means that it is unlikely that major opposition parties can just say that we can solve the blackout crisis, we can solve the economic issues suddenly in these countries. But finally, and this is important as well, citizens tend to be risk averse in these countries. Many of these dominant ruling parties have been in power for centuries and for a very long time, which means that most citizens are used to being under the party and therefore are risk averse to significantly oppositional and distinct political parties. So even if you're not perfectly satisfied with the current party, you internalize, especially through the rhetoric of the major party, that the other party is even worse. And this is the reason why, even if necessarily their burden isn't to defend opposition parties being extreme by nature, how citizens internalize it and how it can be framed is that it is significantly different from what we're doing in the status quo to the point where it won't be efficient on their side. The implications on the strategy of this characterization on the strategy of both teams in this round is threefold. One, this proves that in their likely case, being oppositional and ideologically distinct will be unsuccessful in overthrowing the dominant ruling party. It is completely confusing to me, even after a second opposition speaker, what Team Scotland's winning line in this debate is. What is it? That for some reason we have less decreased loyal voters, which I'll deal with later in my speech, or rather how necessarily they will achieve change for the major oppositional party. Second, even in their best case, in which the party does overthrow the dominant ruling party, they never engage with the segments of our argument that is dependent on this characterization, where inevitably this power will be short-term and volatile, which means that even more supporters into the long term will phase out of the oppositional party and have to resort to voting for the major ruling party again. But finally, what is far more compelling than in this round, and this was our strategy, for the largest opposition party to do is gradually establish its power and traction in the national political sphere. This does not mean 10 years of just waiting for the ANC to slip. It means being actively politically forming coalitions and creating change in South Africa as like the biggest oppositional party with the ANC, so you can prove that you have allyship and experience in order to take over the government. Therefore, I'm going to ask two questions on this basis in this speech. First, on why opposition parties will be unsuccessful, no thank you, and volatile when they are directly oppositional and ideologically distinct on their side. And second, why will oppositional parties be gradually more prominent and successful if they are cooperative and ideologically moderate on our side? On the first question, their central mechanism for why opposition parties will succeed is because people desire real change. The first thing I want to point out is that even if the current party is not doing well, it is unclear why the largest oppositional party can prove citizens and can promise citizens that they quote unquote get real change. The examples and characterizations that they give is so shallow. How necessarily will the largest oppositional party provide a better way in which this blackout issues will be solved? In a vast majority of the countries we are talking about, even if they're the largest oppositional party, the characterization that we forwarded is that they still have far less political contributions, far less political experience, especially in regional levels, than the dominant ruling party. That is why, again, we've proven to you that this main strategy of the dominant party is to say that obviously we acknowledge that we are not perfect, but consistently sticking with us and our long-term vision is better for the country than now switching to an oppositional party, especially when we're in the time of development. For instance, for South Africa, becoming a major economy with the ANC through initiatives like BRICS, instead of completely switching to an oppositional party. This is crucially because these are not countries where the dominant ruling party is so weak. Unless, obviously, given all of opposition's risks, the oppositional party can just stick with their conviction. These are countries that we're talking about where even if the ANC does lose marginally support, it is still overwhelmingly much more powerful than the oppositional party. And that is why what the oppositional party does in these countries in the status quo as well is instead of completely being radical, completely sticking with their principles in order to quote unquote save loyal supporters, they target the moderates and they target individuals that might be necessarily unhappy with the major political party, but not necessarily the ideas in which you can be enforced uniquely on our side in the comparative. Before I talk about the second response, I'm willing to take a POI.
Which side gets healthier democracies? Yours, where you create a super party of people who are all ideologically aligned and do not push for any real change, or ours, where we enable opposition parties to actually call out corruption and the negative actions of governing parties?
I'll deal with corruption later on, but one, it is just untrue that you will always agree with every single thing that the ANC does as an opposition party. Your own response in Sophie's speech is that you are still an opposition party. You still care about taking down the major party, which means that you will still disagree in certain issues. The difference and the deadlock breaker is that you're more willing to cooperate. You're more willing to form coalitions when it is necessary in order to prove that you can create change in these countries. So it is completely unclear, in the same breath with the POI, why change is only achieved through direct opposition. The other characterization that we forwarded, rather, is having more agreements on issues of how to decrease blackouts, instead of both sides saying, oh, our method of changing blackouts is more effective. And these are the types of changes that realistically mean individuals are able to solve a lot of these issues. This is also dealing with their argument on why they will have less internal support, because one, their own characterization is that a lot of these individuals care about immediate issues being solved rather than political ideologies. Insofar as we prove that more issues are willing to be solved instead of having stalemates, it is more likely that these supporters will not leave. But secondly, obviously you do not completely abandon your political ideology, and individuals do not leave the party just because it is becoming more centrist. We think that is a very unfair and irrational, unrealistic characterization of what the supporters look like. Their only path to winning this round then is that it is harder to call out the dominant party for because you have to do cooperation. But firstly, it is unclear what the end implication of this argument is. Calling out is only effective once you have your own voice, once you have your own loyal supporter vote in politics. The problem with these countries is that even if you call the other side or other party that is major corrupt, you are not a better alternative for citizens, which means that they will inevitably be voting for the major party again. We provide more power for the oppositional party into the long term, and that is why we're very proud to propose.
All right, we thank the speaker for their fine speech, and now invite opposition to come and close substantive for their bench. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear and see me okay?
Yep.
Cool. Camera up. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm very glad that third speaker spent the first 3-4 minutes of his speech explaining to you why mainstream dominant parties are still going to keep votes because of things such as the electoral system, because of things such as nationalism and history. I was going to give you those exact same reasons, panel, because those are not only reasons why opposition parties under our side of the house are unable to gain votes, but also reasons why opposition parties under their side of the house are unable to gain votes. If you have two parties that argue on similar lines and don't disagree with each other that much, you're going to go with the one that has the history. You're going to go the one that has the certainty that they're going to be okay in government and not crash the economy, because of the reasons proposition themselves give you. That was a fatal mistake. A couple of things in this speech. We're first of all going to look at voters, and then second of all going to look at influence. First of all, on voters. Proposition tell you they're able to get moderate support under their side of the house at the point to which they align similarly with the mainstream government and dominant party. The problem is, if people are going to keep voting for the established party under their side of the house. If you have similar ideologies and similar policies that do not vary that much, you're going to stick with the established party. Let's quickly run through the reasons, because as I said, proposition give them to you themselves. A, the dominant party has history. The ANC is able to say, we were the party of Nelson Mandela, vote for us, we carry his legacy. B, they are often household names. Opposition parties are often slightly smaller than the dominant party at the point at which they're not in government. Dominant parties have been around for a longer time. They just are more well known in that regard. C, dominant parties have certainty. They have been in government and people are like still living, versus the complete uncertainty of opposition parties under either side never having been in government. But D, there is a difference between consistency and changing ideology. Under their side of the house, opposition parties have made a rapid shift. They are no longer telling you that the dominant party is awful. They're said just saying, oh, they're okay, they may be bad on some policies. You just do not want to vote for a party that is constantly changing its ideology. Under our side, we have consistency. So do the dominant parties. What those four things mean is that they're not able to co-opt moderate support. Under their side of the house, dominant parties are going to keep their voters. They are not going to move to the opposition parties that are now more moderate. The second thing they tell you is that we are incredibly extreme and are therefore not not going to co-opt any support whatsoever. 3 responses to this. First of all, I just want to factually dispute whether this is true or not. I do not think the Democratic Alliance, no, thank you, Democratic Alliance within India is very extreme just because they want to take down Modi and his extreme racist policies. I don't think the DA in South Africa, because they want economic liberalization, are not very extreme just because the ANC wants something different. No, thank you. Just because they are different from the dominant party does not mean they are extreme. Extreme ideologies are incredibly different. Secondly, I would just say I would accept the extreme in our worst case scenario because that means they are opposed to the dominant party. Yes, if you define extreme as being different from the dominant party significantly, that is fine. Because that is when you're going to co-opt voters that are dissatisfied. That is when you're going to co-opt voters that want to change. But third of all, let's give you structural reasons why they're unlikely to be extreme. Because they never actually analyze to you. They simply keep asserting that we are going to be extreme under our side of the house. But the problem is the harms they give you of being extreme are reasons why you're not going to be extreme in the first place. A, you do not appear legitimate, and B, you turn off voters in the moderate. At that point, I just don't think we're going to be incredibly extreme. They cannot simply push this on us without analysing it. Finally, within this clash, let's look at why proposition lose their voters under their side of the house. I want to make it abundantly clear what we're talking about here, because they seem to misconstrue this argument down the bench. What we're talking about is under our side of the house, right now, under the status quo, we have supporters. At the point at which we are a large opposition party, we have a share of supporters in the country. What we tell you is under proposition, they lose those supporters because they move more towards the dominant party. They give you 3 responses to this. First of all, they contradict their own extremism argument at the point at which they tell us we're already moderate and so therefore you're not going to lose voters because our stance isn't changing that much. We've already cleared that up in terms of how we're not extreme but still opposed to the party. So the minute the party moves more towards the centre and agrees more with the dominant party, that is when you lose your current supporters because there's a reason they're voting for the opposition party in the first place. There's a reason they swapped parties, forgot all the historical reasons, forgot everything proposition told you as to why you're likely to vote for a dominant party, and that's because they do not like their policies. You're going to lose them the minute the opposition party start acting similarly. Secondly, they tell you that opposition parties under our side are unproductive and therefore are unlikely to leave the opposition party under our side of the house. 2 responses. 1, this argument is circular. The reason they are unproductive is because they have less votes, apparently, and the reason they have less votes is because they're unproductive. That is the logic of proposition. It is not sound. But secondly, I just think voters who are voting for opposition parties know there is a reason they are unproductive in our worst case. That is because they are a dominant party. But they do not give up because they realise that there are small changes that can be made and eventually enough can be done. Even if they are unproductive, I still think there is hope. The third thing they tell you is that simply they see moderate policies as reasonable and they see the mainstream party as reasonable and therefore it's fine if we have similar ideologies. No, we've already dealt with this. We tell you people who vote for opposition parties dislike the mainstream party's ideology and are never going to follow them. What this means is we get more voters on net. Let's be absolutely clear who we're talking about. Under our side, we keep supporters. We're fine with not co-opting any of the mainstream party's voters, but we keep the ones who dislike them. Under proposition, they lose the ones that dislike the mainstream party because you become incredibly similar, but also they do not co-opt any of the mainstream party voters, as we've explained to you. On net, they have less voters. I want to weigh this incredibly highly in the round because it's the only way to access power and change. If you want to form a coalition on the opposition, i.e. with other smaller opposition parties, you need to have a share of voters yourself to be able to influence policies, to be able to stop supermajority decisions, to be able to push dominant parties and push them into co-opting better policies by providing a threat to their power. You need to have votes in the first place. In our worst case, we are simply trending towards more votes, but we're fine with staying the same as long as we do not lose that power like proposition do. Let's move on to the second class then on influence. I think there is a problem in their case here. They tell you that politicians are likely to cooperate even if regardless of votes. But 2 things. 1, this argument is entirely reliant on votes. As the mainstream party, you have no incentive to cooperate with an opposition party unless they pose some sort of threat to you. That threat requires seats and votes, therefore they do not actually get anything without proving the first class. But second of all, I just think as a mainstream party, party, you're likely to pick other people outside of the main opposition party for two reasons. A, you're historically been opposed to this large opposition party. I don't know why you're going to drop all your history and drop all your animosity to suddenly cooperate with them. But B, I just think you have more leverage over smaller parties. Therefore, you're just going to want to cooperate with other parties on the same side of the spectrum as you that are maybe a bit extreme or maybe more towards the centre, not with the main opposition party. What that means is they do not get cooperation. Finally, let's look at calling out. We tell you that they cannot call out these parties under side proposition because they are aligned similarly with them. They tell you, oh, simply we can still call them out. We give you two reasons from first that are never responded to, which means they cannot call them out. A, you're fearful that you lose the relationship. In your best case scenario, let's say you are cooperating. You don't want to jeopardize that by suddenly telling everyone that the mainstream party is bad, making them angry and pissed off. But B, I just think you're tarnished with the same brush. If you're incredibly similarly ideologically to this party, you don't want to call them out for their actions because that also implicates you. This argument is incredibly important because the only way they're going to get any good policy change is if you are opposed to the party. They cannot pander to them and get any legislation that they want if they are constantly saying, yes, you're good. Only through calling out are you able to get change. Even with less votes, we still win because of this. So proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the speaker for their fine speech and invite opposition reply to come and close our bench as a whole. Hear, hear.
Can everyone see and hear me okay?
Yep, loud and
Great. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I was going to open this speech with a response to that joke about us, but we think that we in opposition, like oppositional parties, should hold more firm to their principles and fight a fairer fight. Questions in this speech then. First, what is the lay of the political land? They try and push a very strange characterization about why we are perceived as extreme. We think that if we are so far from the majority party as it currently stands, then they themselves are not moderate. We co-opt no voters in the middle and we gain no floating advantage. But we think what then happens instead is we start to occupy milk-water stances, and we steal some policies from them to try and co-opt voters. So we trend more in their direction anyway, and we do not disagree openly with the dominant party to try and establish good relations with them. We don't think under our side you're an extreme party. These are the largest oppositional parties. They're occupying a substantial amount of seats in government. They have support and can collaborate with other parties. What happens to voters under their side? Do they gain votes? No. You're just a less interesting version than the current party. You lack all of the analysis that Alex does. You lack all of the history. You lack all of the power and the charisma of household names. You lack all of that. So even if one of them is proved to be damaging, or they have things like issues like blackouts, people aren't going to jump ship. But if anyone is actually ready to jump ship on their side, it's the people who are closest to the edge already. It's the people who are incredibly angry with the party, who've been so angered that they're willing to abandon that. Their lives have been so turned upside down, they'll abandon all of the history. And those are the people most desperate for a change. And if there's anyone who can co-opt them, it's an opposition which stands for something different, which provides policy alternatives and something that is a fresh face from what they've known before. So we do think we over time get more voters. But even if we don't get that, we just keep our position as the biggest opposition. We have to collaborate with other opposition parties, fine, but we call out the governing party. We participate in parliament. We are on committees. We still retain that influence. They lose these voters. Why is that? First, the voters that you currently have will be super angry. They've built an identity about being against the majority ruling party. They're going to be feel incredibly betrayed by this change and very ideologically dissimilar because the pivot has been so strong. Second, the party itself is going to split, which will inevitably drag voters with it. You're going to have some people in powerful positions who are on the fringes anyway, deciding that they cannot stand by this change, meaning the party gets smaller and some voters will go with them. But third, even if you don't think these voters are willing to vote for other people, they're just going to be the types of conscientious voters who then opt to abstain. They become disillusioned with the entire system and they would rather join things like pressure groups than exercise their right to vote. That means you just lose those voters. Why does this matter greatly in this round? Because ultimately, it doesn't matter if they have the things like, I don't know, good relations with those parties. If you only have 3 seats now, then no one cares what you say or what you do. We think our stance as we stand, if it is good as it gets, it is still one we have power. Do that other frames on things like efficiency matter? No, because these good relations ultimately don't mean anything if the good relations just you always agreeing with them and that dominant party can always drop you so you don't retain actual influence. The media will abandon a boring party that is just issuing the same stances. But additionally, as an opposition, we think you get sufficient coverage from your own supporters, but also by being that powerful opposition party. So what this means at the end of the debate is, we're not trying to tell you that we win the presidency, and that's the only case where their extremism analysis would apply, by the way, but we're telling you that we retain our position, and over time, we become more influential. Over time, we build opposition coalitions that bring our parties to the fore. But listen, let's be charitable to them and say that they are able to occupy the same amount of seats as we currently have under the status quo. Why is it not useful to them? This is because they were never able to actively criticize the other side. They were never able to actively call them out, because it would stab in the back any of the good relations they'd spent time fostering, or it would mean calling out policies and ideologies that they themselves stand over, meaning they risk being tarnished with the same brush and losing voters who would disagree with them in those cases. What that means is the capacity to call things which jeopardize the entire political system, like corruption, or just things which you know are likely to be damaging for the country, damaging for the people who vote for you, are things that never get called out on their side, never get publicized sufficiently by whatever media coverage you have, don't get asked directly to leaders in government because you're not using those seats and that time that you have. And for those reasons, they're not likely to pressure for any change or get any efficiency under their side. So even though they have a voice, if they put tape over their mouth and never use it, it doesn't matter. Side opposition.
All right, we thank the speaker for their fine speech and thank our bench as a whole. And now we invite Proposition Reply to come and close the debate as a whole here.
I'm audible.
Yep.
I'll start in 3, 2, 1. We think that the other side's plan works perfectly fine in a competitive democracy, but we told you that the anti-establishment rhetoric simply is inefficient in a country where people are used to one party for several decades, where my grandma and my mom continues to tell me that this one party was the way since a young age. It's hard for me to think that there should be sudden swift change when a party where it only takes over 11% of parliament suddenly being different is going to change something. So then the huge difference between the two cases is how much it considers the context of the motion, which is clearly lacking on the other side. So there are many things to take care of in my speech. First, on the idea of productivity. The question we first ask is, are we distinct enough and can we call out corruption? I think this thing, especially the way that you think about politics, is so much in a vacuum. Just because, for example, I call out the other party of corruption does not mean that I can't work with them. And that does not make sense. If ANC has corruption issues regarding funds and budgets, I can still call them out while still working at a certain district regarding issues of power outages. It's not one or the other. You can still do both at the same time. That's how politics works. But second of all, obviously you would distinguish themselves, and Alex did a good job in also proving this. And from the start of our case, we told you this as well. In the end, sure, you will disagree with some of the stuff that the other party says. You will also politically point out certain parts that you feel like is a problem. But the difference is that under our side, you're more likely to still try to modify certain parts of policies, negotiate and compromise on certain parts, give them suggestions, so at least the policies are not completely the way that you didn't want, but at least some parts you get that you are. Some parts are the way that you wanted it, right? Whereas under their side, because they're less likely to cooperate, because they're all about the idea of being different and being distinct, I think that means situations where you are not politically functioning whatsoever because you are not politically productive whatsoever. We think that under their side, they have a very weird characterization where they think their party has, what, 40% of the votes or something, or at least 30% of the votes or something. But we deny this idea. Often you're just one of the most popular parties amongst a huge, like a coalition of a bunch of parties. Maybe at best you have 11 or at best 20% of the votes. But the difference is that we told you, under your side, if you never compromise the major party, you will not get stuff politically done. And that's when the major party calls you out as a party that doesn't get anything politically done. And that's the reason why they can never take charge of the government. The difference here, we told you, is about the idea of productivity regarding politics. That if you don't pass legislation, if you don't indeed please your voters, that leads to a situation where they're more likely to leave your party. Because you being different is not enough for you to win, especially in a country where they're not anti-establishment, where they are especially more for the establishment for many historical reasons. We told you even in Japan, even in South Africa, because they have bad histories of extremism and also the idea of any kind of radical change and questioning the establishment, they tend to not do that, right? So we think that being different is not enough of a winning angle as to why you win this debate. We think that even in our very worst case, where some of the most loyal supporters don't vote for the majority opposition party, given their own characterization that most citizens care most about solving immediate issues, the major opposition party working with the ruling party to form coalitions and get progress / a gradually larger political say, so it is no longer a dominant rule, is far more stable and effective. We told you under their side, because they do not give any reasons and proper mechanisms as to why they will gain more voters, we think that becomes a huge issue as well. Because getting more voters from other smaller parties within your coalition is not productive, because you will get them as a coalition in the parliament anyways. Rather, the voters you have to get are the people from the ruling party, which are less likely to join your side, whereas on the our side, because at least they see us as a reasonable option, a reasonable politician that we can indeed compromise it, not politicians that always want to have stalemates when it comes to legislation and will never agree with us. They're less likely to join you. So you getting voters are people that will help you in the coalition anyways, but never getting the voters are people that you need in order to make your coalition bigger is a huge mistake politically, and that's the reason why they're out of this debate. We think that under our side, when corruption and stuff does happen, they're more likely to rely on us, think that we are a viable option. We think that their side's idea that someday, apparently, somehow, our policy and us being different will be persuasive enough on an ideological level, where we change the spectrum of people that they have had for centuries. Apparently, that is their winning angle, but that's not productive enough. We told you as to under our side, even if after corruption, they don't buy our case, they don't buy our party, we were still at least functionable, we were at least productive during those times. For those reasons, more than proud to propose.